health, travel, finance, parenting, and entertainment. This is the Suburban Folk Podcast.
I'm looking forward to having some real talk with some real folks.
Welcome to the Suburban Folk Podcast. This is your host, Greg. Today I am joined with Brandon.
Hello.
And Eric. How are you doing?
I'm okay.
So you guys continue to be my repeat co-hosts, so thanks for putting up with me one more time. For the episode today around Star Wars, we are about a week away from episode 9. You two are the experts in the field of Star Wars, so I'm going to be very interested to hear your backgrounds for all things Star Wars. And what we try to do with any of our subject matter is assume people listening are uninitiated to the topic. We're hoping that we can introduce people to the original trilogy in the highest level of terms, talk about what it is that made Star Wars appeal to each one of us, and then on down the line into the prequels, into the 90s, whatever other media you may have been into as Star Wars just became the behemoth that it is, and then into the new movies. I'll call it the Disney era of Star Wars. So Brandon, I think you may be the elder statesman of the group here. Why don't you go first? Tell me when you first got into Star Wars and what exactly was it that spoke to you?
Well, it was a long time ago in a state not so far away, Pennsylvania, where I grew up. But I got into Star Wars pretty much since forever. As long as I can remember, Star Wars was around and something that I enjoyed and loved. I had the toys. I watched the movies as often as possible. I have copies of those movies in every conceivable format. I'm sure if I looked or still had access to those boxes, or if they hadn't been destroyed, I probably had it on beta. But I definitely have the trilogy on Laserdisc because I have those in my attic. I have them on VHS, DVD, Blu-ray, a couple movies here and there on streaming. And I don't know what I liked most about it. I know I liked Jedi was my favorite movie as a kid. I really did like that one the best. But I think I don't know, everything about it. There isn't one thing I can say that I really like about it other than it is a very familiar story just because I grew up with it. And it's got so many different themes that I think even though it's set in space and it's sci-fi, there are still a lot of themes I think that are relatable to people, which is probably why it's endured so long.
You said beta, you think was the first format. Was that just what your family had? How did you get it?
Oh yeah. We had a Betamax player in the house before we had a VHS player.
We had, I guess, an 8mm version was the first one that we had. And Eric, I'll segue over to you. What was your first recollection of having the movies? Sounds like Brandon saying Return of the Jedi, which I'd say for me was was the one that I liked the best. What's your recollection?
I mean, as a kid, my favorite, I think, was also Jedi. As an adult, I still get pissed off when you have people that give the Ewoks a hard time. So I would go with Jedi as a kid. And an important distinction, I believe that we had a bootleg version, 8mm, of Empire to start with. So that's kind of, I think, the earliest memory I have is kind of watching that opening scene.
So I'm with you on the bootlegs. Our beta copies may have been recorded off of HBO or something.
Yeah, exactly. So I remember watching the beginning of Empire over and over and over and over again, and then kind of, working backward to the original movie and Jedi. So, and I would mirror what Brandon was saying that, as a kid, I probably would have just said, I don't know, it's cool. As an adult, I think Star Wars is a familiar story, but Lucas kind of designed that intentionally. I mean, he used a lot of the elements within myth to kind of take things that are universally familiar, and he kind of mashed them up in a new and unique way, and he did it with, kind of new technology. So I think that's really the appeal. It's kind of that universal story that, humans have kind of been telling forever.
And funny you say working backwards with whether it be Empire Strikes Back or Return of the Jedi, and then going back to the original, I'm thinking similar, especially if I had to rank when I was, 5, 6, 7, whenever we first would have started watching those movies. The episode 4 definitely was what I watched the least. Now, I'm not exactly sure why that was, but it was a similar experience. So like I mentioned, maybe for anybody that is potentially uninitiated at this point, one of you guys want to volunteer to give the synopsis of episodes 4, 5, and 6?
Why don't they just watch the Family Guy versions? They're 30 minutes each, right?
Yeah, that's probably right.
Or, it is on several streaming services. I'd say it's worth your time to kind of have a listen. Well, first of all, I want to find the person that has never seen Star Wars that stumbles on this podcast. Well, I got an hour to spend. So, Brandon, go ahead, knock yourself out if you want to do a synopsis. But my recommendation to that would be probably just watch the movie.
I wouldn't do it justice. Like, I would do a horrible job telling the story. But it did make me think of like when my wife and I were dating. One of the things at some point I said, we've been dating long enough, and I'm like, have you ever seen Star Wars? And the answer was like, yeah, kind of. And I'm like, well, no, it's yes or no. So we sat down and watched, and 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, as God intended was the order that we watched it. So that was, she was marrying material after that.
Well, I think I might have even told the story for our Disney travel that, my wife has not seen any of them at all. And I was giving her a hard time about all things Disney. So basically the pact was I would quit giving her a hard time, or less of a hard time, about all things Disney if she went through and watched all of them. So she managed to get through them, but was somebody that had not seen them up to that point. And yeah, mentioning the prequels, like you said, as God intended. Fast forwarding, I think she says the newest ones are the best ones, and even ranks some prequels ahead of the original. So it's hard to get on board with that, I think.
You think?
Yeah.
I could see how someone who's new to it could say that, because they didn't grow up with it. And, maybe it is that we grew up with that original trilogy, in that we put more weight on it because for us it came first. For us it was part of our childhood, and for us there's so many memories attached to it. I think it's difficult to look at it without that type of bias, as compared to somebody who's never watched it and watching them all for the first time as an adult. Playing devil's advocate.
Yeah. I wonder, for our age, one of the things I assume for people that were old enough to see it in theaters, which, FYI, for anybody that does not know us, we were not old enough to see it when it first came out, of course, is the special effects. And, you always hear about the first shot when you have the ship coming over top and how it's sort of larger than life. And if you compare it to movies probably 5, 6, 7, 8 years after the fact, Star Wars is still better special effects throughout, that whole period, I would say. So it's interesting for us talking about, the childhood memories and so on, but we had it all as a package because they were all out. I mean, we 2, 3 years old when Jedi would have first come out, but not going to the theaters to see it at that point. So I wonder if there is that much of a different experience for people that are at this point, 5, 6 years older than we are, that may have actually seen it in theaters, and if they follow it quite as much as folks that weren't around when the trilogy was first coming out, which then again, I guess, puts you in the mindset for people that haven't seen it until their adult years.
Yeah, I mean, it came out. A New Hope came out 2 years before I was born. So
right, right. Well, I will attempt, I guess, a real quick synopsis anyway, just in case there's anybody that hasn't seen it. On the surface of, you're introduced to Luke Skywalker in Episode 4, A New Hope. You're introduced to Darth Vader, who quite possibly is the most iconic bad guy in all movies. I think that's certainly arguable. The main issue is the Death Star. Death Star is going to blow up the rebellion. Luke Skywalker meets Obi-Wan Kenobi, learns the Force, is able to blow up the Death Star. Big battle between Darth Vader and Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan is dead at the end of that one, and that's pretty much the end of A New Hope. Empire Strikes.
Also, spoiler alert.
Well, then that you're really good.
What's the Force?
Yeah, what the Force is. Well, what is it? It binds us, it surrounds us, and I'm sure there's quotes there that I don't have all completely down. Jedis are space wizards. Is that kind of is the way that it works?
It's Star Wars' version of superheroes.
who are really good with swords.
Yeah, and of course the big one for Empire Strikes Back, and the other reason I mentioned for us, again, we didn't get the anticipation of that first movie coming out to the big reveal of Empire Strikes Back that when you watch documentaries you would hear about. But that's the main thing in a nutshell, right? Is that Han Solo gets captured and goes to Jabba. Yeah, you'd have to watch to know who the heck that is and the gangster. But it is revealed that Darth Vader is Luke Skywalker's father, which in the movie before you hear that Luke Skywalker's father, Anakin, was killed by Darth Vader. Not really true. He became Darth Vader. And then get you into Return of the Jedi with the big face-off between Luke and Darth Vader. Ultimately, he is able to turn him back to the good side and defeat the Emperor. And that's pretty much the end of the trilogy, with a lot of special effects and other stuff in between.
Yeah, I'm going to go with my original suggestion of just watch the movie.
Just go watch the movies. So before we go into the time between those trilogy movies and the prequels, is there anything about the trilogy, again, that you guys remember that's worth noting, that is your theory of why Star Wars has been as big as it is, other than it is kind of a familiar story set in space? Anything else that we may have missed?
Well, let's just set the record straight about one thing about the original trilogy, is that Han shot first.
I knew you were going to say that.
And you know what? Disney Plus,
they changed it again. Yeah.
Well, somebody describe it to me, because I don't exactly know what the change is.
He gurgles. It's like, everyone's loved the changes. Maybe if you keep changing it, we'll love it even more. Now he gurgles something. It's like, oh, that makes it so.
He yells McClunky.
Yeah, it's like, oh, it's better now. Now we love it. So yeah, just put it back the way it was, and everyone will.
Was that a Disney change, or would George Lucas have had anything to do with that?
Oh yeah.
No, that was a Lucas change. That was before Disney got hold of it. That was a special edition change, and it was they've improved it, where the original special edition, literally, it looks like someone just kind of yanks at the film negative, and he sort of pops out of the way and then shoots. Disney has continued to tweak it, but that one's on Lucas.
Well, actually, you know what? That's probably a good segue for the timeline, at least from the movies. Skipping the other media, but that would have been the next iteration on the big screen, is with the special editions that had come out. I honestly don't remember how many years ahead of the prequels as were. I'm going to say 5, maybe. Maybe the first one came out about 5?
It was right before it.
Was it?
Yeah, it was a year before, I think, is when they released them.
Okay. And I only ended up seeing the episode 4 in theaters. I managed to miss the other 2.
Well, then I don't know why the hell you're hosting this thing if you only saw one of them. That was an event. I remember that being a giant deal that they were going to be in theaters.
Well, and yeah, I remember when I went to that one, I was the only time I think I've ever been in the exact front row in a theater, because we got there late and it was the only seats that were left. But yeah, I didn't end up catching Empire Strikes Back or Return of the Jedi on the big screen. So yeah, you're right. I do sort of lose my credibility there.
Yeah.
But with the special editions, I guess it depends. Obviously, the Han shot first was the big gift from the first one. There was Jabba. That was the first sense going into the prequels as well that maybe Lucas jumped the gun. I'm going to go back to the special effects, because they're distracting in pretty much every single sense. I'm not sure that any of the stuff that got added really made the movies any better. Am I not thinking of anything? Maybe the Wampa in Empire.
So the Jabba scene was something that was originally shot and intended to be in the movie, but they shot that sequence with a big dude in a giant fur coat. They replaced him with a CGI Jabba. They did their best making Han walk on his tail and all that stuff. And they cleaned up some of the effects, like the glows on the starships. They took the little the film smudge that was underneath the speeder going across the desert. with Luke and Obi-Wan and stuff like that. So, I mean, I think there was some places where it was they kind of did a little bit of cleanup, but it definitely was sort of like or Lucas went a little too far. And I think this really played out in in Jedi. They put that whole musical number in it with Cy Snool.
Yes.
They redid that.
Yeah.
And just like they went overboard with the slapstick comicness of that.
I was going to point to that as the worst that I can think of.
Yeah. And then, they even did it again. They even made tweaks when they put the original trilogy on Blu-ray. They made tweaks to the movies again. They made Vader yell no. They made the Ewoks blink in the Blu-ray special editions. So, this isn't anything new that they've done. It's just, more tweak after tweak. It's just sort of tweaking for tweak's sake. It's really it just wasn't worth it for some of those things. And it's really got a lot of people sort of, pissed about it.
Well, and it's such a weird thing. You don't see that in anything else. I mean, you're right. There was the original special editions, then they revamped it again for the DVD pack and Blu-ray to kind of help match it up with the prequels. And it's sort of, for me, one of the ultimate examples of if it's not broke, don't fix it. Nobody was clamoring for these changes. And, to be fair, I'm always a fan of anything that kind of helps the story move along or makes the story clearer. And I can think of a few minor scenarios where special edition was better, specifically when Han and Chewie are chasing the stormtroopers in the Death Star. And in the original version, the same three stormtroopers turn around and then they panic, and it didn't make a lot of sense. And in special edition, they run into like a TIE fighter hangar and there's hundreds of stormtroopers, and then they panic and turn around. So that was an example of something where I thought it helped make the scene a little clearer, but by and large, and to your earlier point, Brandon, I think some of it might be, this isn't my Star Wars, this isn't how I remember it, but they're making changes like adding Hayden Christensen at the end of Return of the Jedi. Was anyone confused as to who that third person was? I mean, we all got it. We all understood it was Anakin. Like, it just seemed like making changes. They're saying to make it cohesive, but we're not that stupid. Like, we're putting the pieces together. It's fine.
Was it the Blu-ray, I guess, where they tried to connect the prequel and that did, I agree, felt very forced. Even down to the fact that they changed the end music of Return of the Jedi. I don't know why. I think that's what annoyed me the most, because that particular song I don't think appears anywhere else in any of the other movies, so that's just gone.
Yeah, you're correct. They wiped that one out. And there's some other small things that just sort of bug me, like they changed Boba Fett's voice in Empire so that he sounds like the clones did, and it's just one of those things where this was not a problem. We were connecting those dots. It was fine. So yeah, it's a weird scenario where it kind of keeps it's currently being tweaked with the Disney Plus version now. So I really don't understand why that is.
But you bring up Boba Fett. I mean, there's a history of bad decisions in the Star Wars catalog, and Boba Fett was his first appearance is in one of the biggest ones.
Yeah. The
Star Wars Christmas special.
Right.
So, I mean, are we really surprised when some things kind of go sideways?
Yeah, no. And I think the Christmas special is, I think, amazing for how bad it is.
It's amazing.
Some of the silliness involved in it. Yeah. So, I mean, the entertainment value there, but, I think that's the first time that Star Wars kind of made a blatant cash grab. And I would suggest that now it's more cash grab than not. But you're right. It's not like it's got a flawless record.
There's also Christmas in the Stars, the Christmas album.
Yeah. Or any of the assorted disco things that they released along the way.
Yes.
Well, can we at least agree that the worst part of the holiday special is, I don't remember Chewie's dad's name, but him sitting down to that virtual reality thing and watching the disco dancer.
Vaguely inappropriate. You kind of feel like you're watching something you shouldn't be with this like Wookiee guy. Yeah, it's I would say borderline creepy.
Yeah, I mean, you expected him to maybe like throw a couple credits out while the thing was going on.
Yeah.
That's about as nice way of saying it as I could have thought.
Yeah. I don't know what the rating is on your podcast. I don't want to go too far with thoughts on this.
And by the way, I have the Christmas album. They had it at the library when I first got to hear. I managed to get myself a copy after that, which is apparently famous for its Bon Jovi's first recording ever. So there's a little piece of trivia that I found out. Yeah. I forget the name of the song, but yep, he's in there. And so we're also hinting at is Star Wars for children? Is it for adults? Did Star Wars change, or did the people that were children just grow up and want, an older version? And I'm going to use that as my segue into the prequels. Because of course our favorite character, Jar Jar Binks, was probably the primary gripe when The Phantom Menace first came out. So who wants to walk us through their experience with the prequels, the hype, of course, that came with a brand new Star Wars movie 20 some odd years from the last trilogy, and just what it went into all of that?
I'll take a stab at it. So yeah, the prequels, I was 100% on board. As you said, it was better part of 15 years, more than 15 years between anything. And Star Wars fans, the only thing I had to fill the gap were books, comics, video games, that kind of stuff, which some of them were better than others, but it's the same thing as a movie designed to be a visual medium. So I was super pumped up about it. I remember loving Episode 1. I went to see it the opening night, and I went to see it again the following morning. So initially I loved it. I guess I've become a bit of an apologist for the prequels, because a lot of the stuff I hear people harp on, I understand why it's irritating, but for me at this point, it's sort of like I really gauge any new material for Star Wars as, does it make the whole better or does it make it worse? And like Jar Jar Binks is obviously for kids and he's goofy, but he doesn't really impact the story all that much. There's a lot more in Episode 1 as an example, like the midi-chlorians. I was like, well, this has just ruined like a whole aspect of Star Wars. So, and the casting was awkward with that kid was just too young for some of the things that they were, trying to develop. So for me, like after kind of getting over the initial, like, wow, this is great. And there are legitimately, like, Episode 1 seems to be the movie that everyone's like, oh, what a piece of garbage. There are parts of that. The opening scene of that is, in my opinion, is terrific. The ending scene of that, other than, baby Anakin flying around yelling yippee and stuff, the ending of that movie is really good. You've got a lot of kind of awkwardness and strange things to work through in the middle, but I still think there's some redeeming qualities about those movies. So I definitely was caught up in the hype. I'm not nearly as gung-ho as then, but I also haven't kind of thrown it all out or kind of poo-pooed it like I know a lot of Star Wars fans have.
Real quick on the last scene, I thought I've read in the last few years that people are even starting to say that they don't like the lightsaber scenes from the prequels, that they're too overdone. Is that really a critique? Because I feel like that's one of the best parts of the prequels, like any of the lightsaber.
So I've heard that before. Part of what I liked about the middle gap between the original movies and the prequels is the books and comics and that kind of thing. Again, some are better than others, but it let creative people kind of think through in-story explanations for things. And I thought, again, when the prequels came out, those folks kind of went into overdrive. And I thought they were great. I mean, they're just fun to watch. I think there were some really cool characters, Darth Maul being, top of the list. And I heard that criticism, sort of the official explanation was, I think the criticism was like, we got Luke and Vader who are just sort of like, throwing, they're kind of like old school medieval style fencing. And then you've got this where they're doing all these crazy flips, and the kind of in-story explanation I heard was, well, Luke was not really trained. I mean, these guys have been doing it since they were kids and they're full on Jedi, where Luke was just kind of figuring it out, which I thought was, whether that was the intent or not, I have my doubts that was the intent, but I thought it was somebody thinking very creatively on their feet, and I liked the explanation.
Brandon?
Yeah, that same sort of explanation where, the fighting with the lightsabers is more polished. There's more technique to it, is because you're right. And if you think about it, that was the height of the Jedi Order, right? Before they were all killed. Spoiler alert. Um, and like you said, Vader and Luke. Vader was restricted by his body and the fact that he was robotic, and Luke wasn't really well trained, so they were really just sort of hacking away at each other. Whereas you've got these fully trained Jedi who they've gone through the Jedi Temple and all the training and all that stuff. You've got Darth Maul, who was probably the first live action appearance of a dude with a double bladed lightsaber. And it was sort of like, let's see what this badass could do. Because the only other Sith we had seen was Vader and Palpatine, and neither of them could really get around well. So maybe overcompensate for that. And I think that's sort of that same mindset went into the polish that was on the spacecraft, because a lot of criticism was like, oh, why are things so much newer and shinier in the prequels when that stuff was older versus the original trilogy? Well, number one, let's just look at when the movies were made and accept that that's just a reality of production at that time. Number two, it's symbolic of the way the Old Republic was, and then the way things were when the Empire came on board. It was not just a technological shift, but it was almost a that lesser technology, that more industrial look, was a symptom of the overarching evil that was in the universe. So I think that's another way to look at things too. But Eric, like you said, with the with the prequels, I mean, let's be honest. Anybody who says they hated the prequels when they watched them the first time is a liar. We ate it up. We loved it. We wanted it. We needed it, because we hadn't had new content from Star Wars aside from the Droids cartoon series, the little the Ewok series that was on ABC or something. We were waiting for a movie. We had been waiting. It was until 1999. I was in college when it came out. I was fortunate that our college auditorium, they would get pretty early releases of movies, not like right when they were released in the theater, but not long after they were released in the theater. We got them at our college. So it was really great to see that. And me and my friends were total nerds and did lightsaber battles in the aisle. We didn't dress up, but we did that, but unfortunately, over time, they just didn't hold up as well as the original trilogy did. But in that moment, we loved them because it was part of the story that we knew. It was familiar, and it told us things we didn't know. Phantom Menace, if you go and look back, it's like, man, that pod race was really drawn out. And like you said, the kid that played Anakin, man, that dude was kicking a lot of game for a little kid to a much older woman. Attack of the Clones, Hayden Christensen, he's just awkward, extremely awkward. But Revenge of the Sith was pretty rad. It was very dark towards the end once Anakin went to the dark side. And there was a lot of emotion between Anakin and Obi-Wan in that fight, in that final battle, and so there's a lot of high moments, a lot of good points, and I think they closed a nice plot hole for me, which was like, wait a minute, if Anakin built C-3PO, why does C-3PO not know anybody or not know what Tatooine is? And then they had his memory wiped. I was like, okay, thank God. And then for me, that was like, great job, guys, because that's the thing I've been wondering since they first reintroduced C-3PO on Tatooine. But the good thing about the prequels, especially, is that it spawned the Clone Wars series, the animated series, and that is a hell of a series.
Yeah, it is.
And it's a really good one. And if you guys have watched it,
I have, yeah, and I would say it's really good for adults. It's not, people look at it and it's CGI and they think, oh, it's a kid's show. But as a adult, I kind of enjoyed it of its own merit. It's really good, and to your point, it helped build that story up. Where I think I agree. when Revenge of the Sith came out, I feel like it had become cool to just kind of trash Star Wars. And all I heard about from Revenge of the Sith was the end where Vader gets up and does, no, and obviously they're making a tip of the hat to Frankenstein there, and I don't know if that's the right decision or not. But like, if you go see a 2-hour plus movie and all you want to talk about is the 10-second piece of it that you dislike, I think you've kind of you've missed the point here. You're just looking for reasons to dislike it. So my criticism of Sith was that it felt a little rushed, but something like Clone Wars really fills those gaps in, and it does it in a very satisfying way.
Yeah, and we might, and I think, and we'll probably get into this in the sort of the last portion that we want to talk about is the Mandalorian series going to try and tie into some themes from the Attack of the Clones. So we can hope that maybe cloning or that sort of theme may play out more in the Mandalorian.
Well, I have not seen all of the Clone Wars, and I'm a few episodes behind on the Mandalorian.
Oh, jeez.
The only thing I would add for just the prequels in general, and going back to even Phantom Menace, the other, not only midichlorians, but when Shmi Skywalker says that essentially Anakin is Jesus because there was no father, just didn't seem like the most creative thing to do in the world. No, I think there's also rumors going on that they maybe are going to try and close that loop in some way with the new movie. I thought I've heard that. Who knows what exactly that may or may not entail. And then again, Brandon, you mentioned the pod racing. Eric, you mentioned the age of the actor that was Anakin. And that was really my main critique, is just, yes, that part was long. And also it just set up the next two to have to cover a lot of ground that ultimately I didn't think it had the chance to cover. I always said in a nutshell, they needed to have Revenge of the Sith, while I think it was a solid movie, basically just mostly Darth Vader, mostly hunting down as many Jedi and having as many like knockdown, drag out battles as it possibly could have. And there just wasn't any time to devote to that, I think, because Phantom Menace left so much still to get to in the next two movies. So that's what I really remember thinking.
Well, if you want to watch hunting down of Jedi, you're going to need to watch Rebels, Star Wars Rebels.
Okay. And when did that come out? That's a relatively recently, right?
Started when Clone Wars wrapped up, so I'm going to ballpark it at like 4 years ago, something like that, 3 or 4 years ago.
2014.
I have plenty of non-movie Star Wars media to consume, clearly, which I think that gets us to all things non-movie. Books, comics, video games, TV shows like we've touched on. Eric, I'm going to let you start. Talk about, from even the original trilogy, what type of media you do, maybe storylines that were better than others, and where that went leading up to the prequels, and then maybe where it went after the prequels.
So I really focused on the novels, which is now the Legends version of the Star Wars timeline. And I, for the most part, liked them. I mean, there's a ton. I'm not going to go through individual ones. It started with the Timothy Zahn series, where it kind of reintroduces the characters. They bring in some villains that are really interesting in their own right. That I know they've already introduced Thrawn via the shows. So it gave you something familiar, but it also introduced some new things. I'd like to say all of the books were as good as that. That's not the case. Some of them kind of felt like a rehash. But that was really what I got into primarily. And I think potentially I'm still kind of struggling with that. That, in my opinion, that timeline is sort of what we all hoped. I mean, Han and Leia get married, they have kids, Luke gets the Jedi Order going back again, and it's sort of what you hoped the story was going to be. And I would suggest the new movies are not at all. If someone was writing out what they sort of hoped the next step was, unless you're some kind of sadist, I don't think anyone was picking out what the new movies are doing. I was, as much as I love comics, I was a bit of a latecomer to the comics. Again, some of those stories were really good. Especially, I would say they actually got I don't know if I want to say better. Kind of the prequel and before era comics, I think, are the good ones, where you've got like Tales of the Jedi and that kind of thing, which takes place thousands of years before the movies do. And then when the prequels came out, that kind of expanded in a good way. There's some lowlights, which, I wish I could say I've got a lot of optimism for this new movie, but I think they're taking some story ideas from one of my least favorite, which was Dark Empire, which, long story short, the whole point of the trilogy is, Luke resists the dark side. He now becomes a new Jedi. And then that series came out and it was like, no, actually, he just decided to join the dark side because clone Palpatine is here. And I just thought it kind of undermined the entire whole point of the movie trilogy. So that's an example of more of a low light. But I think that's a case where the prequels might have helped the quality and kind of brought a little more focus to what was the expanded universe is now the Legends universe.
I think I had just read, I forget where, a comparison of Lucas and the prequels, and again, all the reasons we've talked about, much maligned, versus what Disney has done up to this point, which seems to be fairly paint by numbers, pretty predictable as far as killing off all the characters and where we're going to end up. And yeah, it was at least giving the prequels credit for the worlds that were used and created, and especially with weaving all of the other media, again, in particular the TV shows, into something that actually maybe was more well thought out than it was originally given credit for, as to where we are now with the new movies. Brandon, how about for you? What were the types of books, comics, video games, TV shows that you were watching in between the movies?
While I was in college, I had an old Atari game that was about Star Wars, and it was very like wireframe based, and it was literally the worst. I never had ET, but if I had ever played the ET Atari game, I guess this would have been my version of the Atari game. I don't know if it was an Empire Strikes Back or a New Hope or a Jedi game, but you were supposed to shoot stuff and fly a vehicle somewhere through space. So that was like the first Star Wars video game I ever played, and it was terrible. So that held me over for a while, until I'm thinking the Super Nintendo, the SNES, Star Wars games came about, where you're like jumping around as Luke with a lightsaber and you're holding it upright straight to deflect the blasters. And you're jumping up and down the platforms on the sand crawler. And then I played the Rogue Squadron video game for PC, and that game was legit. Like, I had a joystick for it, and that was like really like the coolest thing. And you could put in the codes or download the mods to fly a TIE fighter or the Naboo starfighter. Those were like the add-ons that you got afterwards. So like that was a really cool game that I remember playing in college, was that Rogue Squadron game. But after that, I'd have to say my all-time two favorite Star Wars games were the Knights of the Old Republic games, because it gave you a glimpse at pre-New Republic times, and it talked about some of the Jedi and Sith mythology, the lore that you never got from the movies. And I never read any of the books or the comics up until very recently. So, that was talking about Darth Revan and Darth Malak, and, just that it's just adding to that mystique of what the Sith used to be before the Sith that we knew in Sidious and Vader and Maul, and what was the other guy? Darth from Clone Wars. Not from Clone Wars, but from Attack of the Clones.
Oh, Tyrannus. There
you go. The forgotten one. Because he was just sort of there.
Yeah, exactly right.
Right? But I'd have to say it probably wasn't until I moved down here to Virginia. So it was post 2005, 2006. that I was finally sort of like, man, I'm hungry for some more content. Like I want to do some more. Maybe it's like for like finally like the 7th or 8th time that I finished Knights of the Old Republic, and I'm like, I'm tired of this. I want something new. So I dove into the Hand of Thrawn trilogy, and I like burned through those 3 books, and then I think I started another like a 4th book, and by that point I was like, I had just burned through three books as fast as I could, and I'm like, yeah, I'm not going to finish this. And then just sort of put things down and went back to my old school Star Wars days of just watching the original trilogy and watching the prequels and just being happy knowing that's all I'll ever have. And then Clone Wars came out, so I watched that, and then I was like, oh, the Force Awakens is coming. And it was a brand new happy day.
One thing I'm thinking of with the video games as you're going through those, has there ever been an easy Star Wars video game? I remember some of the NES games we had. The one for New Hope was hard. I think we had the Empire Strikes Back one, which was hard. I don't remember if they made a Return of the Jedi or not. I've heard that the SNES game was also very, very difficult. You mentioned Rogue Squadron. Before that was
Rebel Assault.
Oh, that's the game. That's the one.
Rebel Assault was
Oh, was that the first person shooter?
It was sort of like Rebel Assault was sort of a mixed game. Like you flew a X-wing at the beginning, but then there were some where you're, I think you get to use a lightsaber in it, but I know there's a point where you're using a blaster, and it was really hard. It was sort of the game before Star Wars games really took off, and X-Wing was a great game, but impossibly hard. And you had every time you died, you had a chance of, every time you got shot down, you would either be killed, which happened most of the time, and you had to start over. You would be captured by the Empire, and you had to wait like real time months before you would finally get a thing that was like, you've been released, you can start playing your game again. Or if you were really lucky, you'd get rescued. So I remember, I think part of the reason I got into computers was because of Star Wars games. It was like, we need to find your save file, and then if you die, you log out of the game, and you go back in and you restore your save file, and then you re-log into the game. And it's like, boy, this sounds like a lot of work for entertainment.
Maybe that's why I was into TIE Fighter, because I remember with TIE Fighter, you could just set it up where you couldn't be shot at all. And I don't remember the wait time.
I was going to say the answer to your question on has there been an easy one, it's TIE Fighter, because yeah, you could make yourself invincible and you could still progress through the game.
That's why I liked it. I like the ones where I don't have to work too hard. Because I even feel like with some of the more recent ones, like Battlefront, isn't that the one that's also kind of either you love or hate, but it's a pretty tough one?
Well, Battlefront is designed as a player versus player game. So, yeah, if that's your thing, it's great. For me personally, I don't want 13-year-olds like cursing at me and telling me I suck and that kind of, so that's just not my style of play. But I think if you're into that kind of game, it's no more challenging than another game in that genre. Maybe
you should just try not being a noob.
Yeah, I guess, see, that's the thing, but then I'm not investing enough time to not be a noob, I guess. So for me, it's just like, I don't need to be subjected to people giving me a hard time because I'm not putting enough sweat equity into my video gaming.
But that was it the new Fallen Jedi game that just came out? Looks pretty legit, though. Or Jedi Fallen Order.
Yeah, and you hit Knights of the Old Republic's great.
Yes.
So, yeah, and even TIE Fighter, while you can make it easier, TIE Fighter's the first game I remember loving because it had a story built into it. As you progress through the game, you're becoming like the hand. I think the highest level you can reach is the Reach of the Emperor, because you had like Empire mission objectives, and then you had like Palpatine's personal assistant mission objectives for everything. So you could try and do everything, or you could focus on one or the other. And as you completed Palpatine missions, there was a tattoo you could look at in your profile, which showed you what rank you were for the Emperor personally. And I thought that was super awesome.
Well, I guess we are to the point of the new movies. Maybe we'll hit the highlights of the non-episode movies. I'm sure there's a different name for it, but Rogue One and Solo. So let's start with Rogue One, because I will say that if I'm having to rank all the movies, it's at least in my top 5, maybe even higher than that. That suffice it to say, it made one of these movies for the way that people that have been longtime fans of Star Wars wanted one of the movies to be made, including Darth Vader just being super dark, super badass. What I think, like I said, I was hoping for maybe more of in Revenge of the Sith. So what do you think for Rogue One and Solo? Brandon, we'll let you go first.
I agree with you. Of all the new ones that came out, I'd have to say Rogue One is probably the best of all of them. And I think it was, I think it really took, I think it was what was so good about it is that it was very focused, right? It was, how did the rebels get the plans for the Death Star? It sets up the original trilogy. That movie was based off of one line, right? And it's just, it was so dark. There was a very human aspect of it in the fight and the plight of the rebels, of the people who are fighting reluctantly in this rebellion. And it's just dark. And there were some sad endings to Star Wars movies of, we were sad that Anakin got his limbs lopped off and he became Darth Vader. That was very sad. And that he killed all these kids and in the Jedi Temple. We were sad when Han Solo got frozen in carbonite. But spoiler alert, Rogue One, everyone dies. Literally everyone you put equity in for that entire movie is now dead. The Empire has the Death Star. Yes, the plans get out, so ultimately things turn out fairly well. But I mean, it's just a great movie, and I feel like they had just the right amount of humor in there with the robot, the droid.
I can't think of his name. I know what you're talking about.
But like he was like the perfect amount of humor to have in that movie. It wasn't over the top. He had great one-liners. He was a great foil, a great, he was that sarcastically funny guy who was the great opposition to this entirely just horribly dark movie. So I mean, Rogue One definitely gets my vote for the best of the new live action series that have come out.
And the other things that stick out to me for this one is the new characters they introduced. Like you said, they did a nice job of developing them that you actually, by the end of the movie, care about them, even though you know what's going to happen before it happens, as far as everybody's going to get blown up on the final one.
Well, no, actually, the original version of the script, they made it out.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because, and Eric, you probably know this because I'm going to take your nerd level to the top of the game here. I think you're at the top of the charts. But there was a shot in like the original trailer where they were running on the beach with the data pack, and they made it off the tower, right?
And they did an extensive reshoot for that. I mean, Rogue One was the Star Wars movie I didn't know I wanted. When I heard that, to your point, Brandon, they took one line and made a movie out of it, I was like, oh boy, this is going to be like the worst cash grab. And the premise didn't even sound all that intriguing to me. But then watching it, and right before it was released, it was announced they were doing extensive reshoots. So I'm thinking, this thing is just cobbled together. It's going to be a disaster. And then when I saw it, as I said earlier, at this point, anything Star Wars related, I'm kind of looking at it to see, is it making everything a little better, or is it making everything a little or a lot worse? And Rogue One is the first one that came out that, as we were talking earlier, yeah, the Vader scene is amazing. They even did it in that, he's just a tank going through. There's no finesse to it, which only forces, what you see in the original trilogy. When they have Red 5 go down, and that's like a nerd thing. It's like I felt like they were talking directly to me. I was like, oh, Red 5 died. Oh, that's why they just let some no-name kid fly. They just needed a body. And so like they put all those little kind of tip of the hats in, and then I would agree with everything you guys said before. It's they develop the characters well, there's the right amount of humor, you really start to get invested in it. So for me, other than the original trilogy, Rogue One, and it's not close, Rogue One is the best by a landslide. I like Solo, but I don't know that it really propelled things forward. It was interesting. There were some pieces of it I liked better than others. I think I liked that they started tying in some Clone Wars things here and there. There were some other things that I thought were maybe a little over the top. So I liked Solo, but for anything that Disney has released, Rogue One is a 10, and everything else is no more than a 4.
Yeah, and Solo is good, but it did seem that like there was times where it sort of dragged on, and it's definitely not my favorite, but it did set up potentially more movies or shows because they just surprise everybody with Darth Maul at the end of this thing, and who, if like we talked about, if you watch the Clone Wars or Star Wars Rebel, really does play a major part in both of those series. So, if you're only looking at Darth Maul as to what he's done on the big screen or where his impact has been on episode 1, and then again he shows up in Solo, that's sort of like, now that could be some straight up Disney marketing machine right there. It's like, okay, you like Darth Maul in episode 1, you've been hungry for him, you've missed him. We're gonna pepper in a little bit of Darth Maul here, and you're like, where do I get him? Well, you go to Rebels, you go to Clone Wars, and you're just sucked back into that cycle of more Star Wars content to watch, to consume, to buy if you have to.
Yeah, I made the mistake of finding out that Darth Maul is in Solo before actually watching it, and I didn't realize it was so far to the end. So I think I was so in anticipation of him showing up that, yeah, the movie was fine. I feel like Chewie has been so downgraded in all of the other new movies that it was nice that he got to be more than just a bystander, which is what it's felt like with 7 and 8. Yeah, it wasn't a bad movie, but I don't remember anything that really stood out too much. And the only other thing I would add for Rogue One as well is Grand Moff Tarkin is awesome as well. I mean, the way they did his CGI character, and it was as seamless as it was going to get. And I really appreciated them even building his character up, leading up to A New Hope, which was just yet another thing that they did really, really well.
I'm going to agree. Like putting him, the way they shot him, and I think they were very, very careful about how they did him. Showing him in sort of shadowed in darkness. It shows again how far technology has come since the prequels, right? Mm-hmm. Then the prequels, they were like all about showing off how good can we make the CGI? How much can we show off this tech? And I think this might be a good transition, not about Rogue One and Solo, but into the Force Awakens and Last Jedi. Is that from a special effects point of view, you see Grand Moff Tarkin, you see the new series, the new movies, they've gotten back to sort of that base where the original trilogy was with practical effects. It's grittier. There's more realism to them. There is CGI involved, but it's a much better balance. It's a much better blend than leaning like the prequels did. They just leaned so heavily on the special effects that it became comical after a long time. So I think they learned that lesson, and let's do some more practical things when it comes to special effects in the new movies.
I totally agree with that they look way better, where the prequels could tend to be distracting with the technology they were trying to use wasn't quite there yet. And yeah, like you said, having the actual sets complemented by the CGI works better than just relying so heavily on the CGI. So, Eric, we'll kick it back to you. We've got episode 7 and episode 8. Synopsis and your thoughts when you went to go see those movies.
I would agree. I think the practical effects help, though I would say by the time you got to Revenge of the Sith, they were kind of toning down the CGI enough that it was not distracting like it was in the original. So I think it looks better. I just wish they would have gotten a story together to go with it. Because I remember I heard a lot about Force Awakens before going to see it, because I didn't see it. It had been out maybe a couple weeks, and I kept hearing, "Oh, this is great, this is great." And I remember watching it and just thinking, I remember the first time I saw this when it was called Episode 4. There was nothing new. It was just a rehash, but it wasn't even a creative rehash. It was just sort of like everything got a little bigger and a little faster and a little more, by proxy, a little more convoluted. So I just remember sitting through the movie and I kept thinking, when is the good part coming? I kept hearing about, why this is good or how great this is. And it was sort of tip of the hats in the wrong way. I mean, halfway through that movie, I was sort of expecting the cast to just stop and lead the audience in applause that Harrison Ford was back as Han Solo. I mean, it was so over the top that it was about Han Solo and here he is, it's Harrison Ford. Can you believe he's back? That it just, I just didn't and don't have a lot. In my opinion, Force Awakens is the worst Star Wars movie ever made. It just goes nowhere. There's no new thought. I still don't really care about these characters. If they killed all of the new characters off, I think Kylo Ren is, as I refer to him, Darth Wiener. I don't find him threatening. I don't care about his story. I don't care, what his motivations are. It just seems so convoluted. And I have not read some of the books and things that give you sort of behind the scenes, and maybe I need to do that. When all the planets get blown up, you don't even know what's happening. It's just like, well, I guess do we care that these planets got blown up by this ridiculous planet-sized monstrosity that is just basically a bigger version of the Death Star? So I remember kind of processing it, and the more I thought about it, and we could do a whole show on all the problems I have with Force Awakens, but I think at the end of it, what really kind of rubbed me the wrong way is not only did they rehash something that already existed, they made it a little worse in the process. I'll give you a specific example, which still irritates me. When they have the Millennium Falcon kind of light speed right to the planet, it undid what had been pre-existing, where you had to get out of a gravity well before you could use your hyperdrive to get away from things. So if you take that logic and then streamline it down through the rest of the movies, so Han Solo is basically an idiot. In the first movie, he's calculating all this stuff, and dude, just hit the button. It's literally as simple as just hit. Why didn't you do this when you were leaving? Just hit the button. So it not only did I think it was bad, it made everything that came before a little worse. Tirade over.
That was pretty good. I was going to point out the one critique that I always remember reading was when Leia basically cold shoulders Chewie after Han's dead, goes against Rey. I was like, really?
At least that one, they came out afterward. J.J. Abrams straight up came out afterward and was like, I dropped the ball. Yeah, I definitely should have seen that. But yeah, I mean, that's literally, I could probably go on for an hour about all the ridiculous things that are in Force Awakens that just make no sense whatsoever. But I'll leave it at that tirade.
Brandon, what do you think for episode 7?
Well, it's going to be difficult for me to follow that one up. But let's start with a few things. Chewie's been has not been getting his fair shake of things or credit of things since episode 4. He didn't get a medal.
That's true.
Why?
Is there Wookiee racism in Star Wars? I don't know.
I was going to say, I think it's a commentary on racism is what it is.
I don't understand that. You said they toned back the special effects on Revenge of the Sith. They fought on flying robots on a lava planet.
Yeah, but I think by that point, I guess the technology had come far enough where there was definitely, so my biggest criticism of Revenge of the Sith, which I'm surprised, like I never hear anyone except me complain about this, is they have that giant fight all over the planet, and then at the end of it, Obi-Wan says, I have the high ground, you can't win. I have the high ground? Like, we've literally been, like, springboarding all over the place, but you have the right piece of dirt, and, like, that means you win. So, yeah, there's definitely still some silliness in there, but I think
perhaps
the technology had come to a point.
Perhaps he was talking about the moral high ground.
Yeah, yeah. And that works great figuratively. Unfortunately, it doesn't make an ounce of sense literally. So, yeah, it was like, well, what?
So let's talk about The Force Awakens and Last Jedi. I have resigned myself to the place where I am happy that I have them. I'm just happy. I you know, we talked so much trash on the prequels, and it's like, you know what? I'm just happy I'm getting new movies. Because you know what? I'm going to watch them. I like watching them. I like The Force Awakens more than I like Last Jedi. Last Jedi, I mean, I think Luke's performance seemed a little forced. I think that whole thing about everything you just said was completely wrong. Like, it was forced the first time he said it, and then he said it a second time at the end, and I'm like, this is bad. So, sorry, Mark Hamill. I didn't like it, but I think they got a little bit better mix of humor than the prequels, where like I said, the humor in the prequels went a little bit too slapstick and too corny and cheeseball. So I think they got better at that. However, that creature that was in the cargo ship where the Millennium Falcon went into, that big giant rolling ball of death, that was a bit silly and weird. But I mean, overall, I'm just happy to have new movies, and I'm honestly just happy the fact that we can like sit and talk about these things. And honestly, I just like the stories they're coming up with just because they're there, and then I get to rank them, and then I get to talk to you guys about them. So you know what? Some of them are going to be good, some are going to be bad. I'm just literally happy that there's new Star Wars movies, because I mean, if you look at the first 3 movies that came out, you could literally call except for like, little tastes here and there of the cartoons that were out and the Ewok series. There was like a drought of Star Wars stuff. And now we are just being bombarded by it, and we can actually pick and choose what we want to watch. So I'm going to say I'm happy to have them.
I definitely agree that episode 7 is a rehash of basically A New Hope. So totally agree with that. And this is just my own theory of even going into these movies. Like, if you look at the main 3 characters, Harrison Ford, Mark Hamill, and Carrie Fisher, like, of the 3 of them, who had the best career? Obviously Harrison Ford. Which one of them are you probably not going to get for the next 3 movies? Harrison Ford. Gee, is Han Solo going to die in this first movie? Yeah. Like, it's just, even if you sort of step back into real life and, who they're only going to get to sign on for one, and then it almost feels like their original thought is each one of these movies would be a sort of a swan song for the 3 main characters from the original, obviously with Carrie Fisher dying after Last Jedi. That had to be shifted in some way. I guess that's what we're going to see. But then the same thing with Mark Hamill. Okay, I've got Carrie Fisher, I got Mark Hamill, who relatively speaking has had more of a career since, those original Star Wars. Probably Mark Hamill. Probably he's going to be the second one to go in there. And then, I know they originally said that Leia was going to have this major impact and effect. And again, I guess remains to be seen what and how they shifted from there. But even that of bringing in the characters, obviously the marketing is very easy to understand that they're bringing those characters for people like us to go and see the movies and then trying to get you to latch on to the other characters. Eric, I agree with you that there's nothing about the new characters that I'm overly invested in. I don't really have a favorite with any of them. If anything, I'd say maybe for Last Jedi, I like Laura Dern as an actress, and I thought she did okay. I also like Benicio del Toro, but the whole casino scene thing, going back to like pod racing, like, oh my goodness, that whole scene, which, what does it run, like 20 minutes, maybe even longer than that. That seems to if it wasn't already derailed, maybe got derailed at that point. Now, on the other end of sort of whatever the logic is for space travel and so on, a lot of people complained about driving the ship back into whatever the big Star Destroyers now, they call it something different, I'm pretty sure. It wasn't Starkiller Base, whatever they call the big dreadnoughts or something.
Yeah, I think, yeah.
That didn't bother me. I mean, it seemed to make sense as like a kamikaze run. But I know there was some sort of complaints about that somehow defied the laws of space battle in some way. However, I just watched the movies again, of course, in anticipation of the new movie. And with that opening scene with the bombs that get dropped and the Rose's sister, whatever her name is, that makes them go, it occurred to me, aren't they in space? Why do those bombs actually go down?
There's gravity within the spaceship, and that's what the inertia, it forces it down onto the ship.
I like that.
Is that official, or
it's
is
official
that...
now? There's the explanation. See, I was just saying I like creative explanations for what the real reason is they wanted to do like a World War II analogy probably, but I like that. I like you've got an explanation, Brandon. So we're going with that.
God bless.
Well, we definitely hit Force Awakens. Anything else with Last Jedi before we close it out with expectations for the new movie?
No, I actually feel like I need to watch Last Jedi again. I had kind of a mediocre response to it. Again, I've become too much of a Star Wars nerd. I was so flabbergasted that they just did like a one-liner that Admiral Akbar had been killed. I was like, no, you do a close-up, he yells, it's a trap, and then you can kill him, but you don't just like sweep him out. Otherwise, I didn't have quite as visceral reaction to that. But I think it's because Episode 7 kind of, for me, reset the bar on what I think so.
And for the new movie, I've watched a couple of the trailers. We hinted at least, that seemed like Darth Sidious is going to be back in some form. I don't know what those theories are supposed to be. I didn't realize that it's possibly a clone because I had not read any of those other backstories or anything like that. But any expectations for you guys coming into the next movie? Brandon, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a lot of unknowns with this one. You know, is this happening on Endor? Are we going to see Ewoks again? Is it really Palpatine? Is it his dark side of the Force projection onto the ruins of the Death Star that crashed? Is he actually alive still? Is it some other form of him, or is the speaking? Is it coming from some type of a Sith holocron? So I think there's so many questions out there, and I think with all of the elements that have been built up in the Clone Wars and Star Wars Rebels between Jedi and Sith elements, I think they actually have a pretty deep pool to go to, whether they'll go to that or not for the masses. Because I mean, you have to think they have to keep the movies kind of broad stroke, right? They're not going to dive into things like they will with the comics or the books or the animated series, just because those are for a different audience, a much more hungry audience who really wants to dive deep into Star Wars. There's things, and my friend Matt and I were talking. And he's like, "Oh, I think it's going to come out that Rey is a clone of Leia, or maybe she's a clone of Palpatine somehow." So who really knows? I mean, there's so many different ways this could go, but I would like to find out who Rey's parents are, because I think that's a big question on everything, and hopefully we get closure on that. But I would just like to say I hope Rey is not a Skywalker, a Kenobi, or a Palpatine. I hope she's some other thing, some other family, or some other, I don't know, whoever she is. I just hope she's not one of the main ones. Sort of like the Force elite family member, and she's sort of like a broom boy from Last Jedi, where anybody could be a Force user, but at least explain who her parents are. That would be nice.
I would echo that sentiment. That I think that was another critique from the last movie, that your parents were nobody. Well, hopefully that was just sort of talking point there that they resolve that in some way. Eric, what about you? Are you holding out hope for any redemption?
Yeah, oh, yeah. I mean, definitely. If they could kind of somehow pull all this together and tie it up where it starts to make some more sense to me, that would be great. And I actually thought that was a pretty good summary, Brandon. I mean, pulling from some of the things that I we already know work would be nice. I'd love for it to be a holocron. All of a sudden, that's something that I would be back on board for. I'm nervous about the thing, and that's probably a little bit of a bias from some of the worst stories that came out of the old expanded universe clones. So I'm always kind of a little skeptical of that whole thing. But yeah, something that kind of cherry pick the best of what's out there, and if it's not broke, don't fix it. So kind of pull those things in, and I'm hoping they do it in a way that I start to care about the character. I mean, I'd love to come out of the movie and be like, I had some reaction to one of these new characters, good, bad, or different, but something where I actually feel like I'm invested in the story. And I know I've heard Rey, anything from she's a new virgin, where she's basically like a reincarnation of Anakin, and that's just a thing. I don't know. Maybe they could spin that, and that would be interesting. Or somehow make an attachment to Kylo Ren, where you get some piece of the backstory where he's more of a tragic figure rather than just a whiner. I'm just something that makes me connect to these characters. And I know with the name of the movie, I've heard a lot of theories that kind of get into the Skywalker is going to be the gray Jedi. They're not quite evil, they're not quite good, and that ground's been covered pretty extensively in other media, and it can be interesting. Sometimes it gets overdone, but I could see them doing something interesting with that. But I'm really hopeful that somehow there's some thread that's gone through this thing I'm missing, and they have kind of a rogue, or I have kind of a Rogue One experience where it's like, okay, this was sort of the piece that I didn't know I was missing, and it really kind of pulls it all together and improves the whole thing.
Any other hopes beyond episode 9 when we wrap up here? I think officially Disney is not really saying what they're releasing next as far as the main timeline of there's not going to be an episode 10 anytime soon. I know, gosh, I think there was potentially a Boba Fett. Was there even going to be maybe some other solo installments? All those sort of backstory ones, as far as I'm aware, are pretty much on hold. But anything you guys are looking forward to beyond episode 9?
I know I haven't heard anything official, but I know there's been talks as a standalone movie, an Obi-Wan movie that takes place between Sith and the original. And I guess Ewan McGregor has said he's interested in doing that project. I think that could be a really interesting movie, especially if Ewan McGregor was involved. I think he's one of the shining bright spots from the prequel, so I'd love to see him return to the Obi-Wan role. And really, I mean, as we've talked about, like Clone Wars, I have not started watching Mandalorian, but really, as far as I'm concerned, they haven't missed on those kind of things. And I think part of that is they've got a group of kind of dedicated fans that are producing those things, and they just come up with really good ideas because it's a passionate group of people making it. So for me, I'm always interested in consuming new content. So I hope that the shipping out, at the same, what I would consider same high quality, I think they really help kind of fill in some of the gaps that the movies just can't. I mean, you can't watch you're not going to make a 10-hour movie. So I think the shows are great for that.
Brandon, how about you? Anything beyond the movies?
Yeah, I think the Obi-Wan, it's actually going to be, it was announced earlier this year, it's going to be an Obi-Wan series with Ewan McGregor on Disney Plus. So that's going to be a good one to watch.
Is that confirmed then? They are going to do it as a show?
Yeah, I believe they revealed that at earlier this year.
Okay.
That it was going to be a show. But as far as shows go, we touched on this in the very beginning with the Mandalorian series. I know, Greg, you said you're a couple episodes back, but if you at least seen like probably episode 2 or 3 of the series,
Mm-hmm.
The Spoiler alert, there's a baby Yoda, if anybody hasn't been on any type of social media.
For those of you using the internet, if you haven't been on the internet, there's a baby Yoda.
Yeah. There's a baby Yoda. It's not actually baby, and spoiler alert, it's not actually a baby. It's not actually baby Yoda. It's just a baby of his species, number 3 that we've seen. Okay. Yeah. So the Mandalorian, the one of the characters in there, this doctor who was experimenting on baby Yoda, a patch on his arm looks very similar to the patches that were worn on the arms of the clones from Attack of the Clones. So I think it's kind of cool. They're trying to bring a, maybe some legitimacy to the prequels, or legitimacy to some of the themes that were in the prequels, and maybe make people more comfortable with them. But I mean, The Mandalorian is just, that thing keeps getting better and better. I've heard some people kind of dog it for a cheeseball soundtrack, but I'm like, just get over it. Like, relax, people. Again, just let's relax. It's a movie. We're loving the fact there's a whole series about the Mandalorians. We really, it's another opportunity to take a dive into that mythology. The Star Wars Rebels gets into some of the Mandalorian culture. Knights of the Old Republic, that game for me got into talking about Mandalorians. Now, I didn't read any of the books or any of the comic books that talked about Mandalorians. So, it's just a great deep dive into, or it's starting to get to be a deep dive into the Mandalorian culture and the storyline of a brand new character who you care about. So, Eric, you said you don't care about the characters you really don't care about the new characters that have come out in the new series. I'm going to be honest, I can't remember a lot of their names in the new series. But at least I know the Mandalorian. That's how I know him. And you want him to win, even though he's this bounty hunter. And it's it's one of those great dualities where you've got this hardened bounty hunter who's going out and hunting down people, potentially killing them. He literally he vaporized probably like half a dozen Jawas, with his rifle. But then he has this soft spot in his heart for this baby Yoda being. And it adds so much depth of emotion that has to be portrayed in his actions, in the dialogue, in the script writing, because there's no face. There's no face to connect with. You only see him wearing a helmet. So I think it's very well done in the fact that you have all of this humanity in this character who you've never seen his face, but yet there's some very human and very relatable emotions connected to him. So I think The Mandalorian is absolutely a stellar series. And, I think people are being very short-sighted if they're dogging the soundtrack or dogging the, I don't know, there was one episode where he's riding some creature that looked like a really shrunken down T-Rex without a giant head. It looks almost looked like a running meatball with tiny little arms. But that thing had shown up in like a comic book or a book somewhere earlier on. So it's like, that thing was already in the universe. Relax. But yeah, Greg, you need to stop this podcast tonight and go watch The Mandalorian and get caught up.
I think that's a good place for us to get to our closing. Yeah, maybe Star Wars will do the inverse of Marvel. I think I just saw today that Marvel is stopping, I thought it said all of their TV
All TV projects, they're halting them. Yeah.
Yeah, so maybe it'll just be the inverse, where Marvel's TV ventures have not done so well, but of course the MCU has been huge. Maybe with Star Wars, the movies haven't been quite what people have been looking for, but they're gonna find new life with the new series that they've got coming out. So, I think we're gonna sign off now. We will all probably have seen the movie, let's say within a week or two of it coming out. So we'll all try to get these guys to record a quick synopsis and review of the movie, and we'll put that into a follow-up episode. So guys, I appreciate it, and I will talk to you later.
Thanks.
Bye.
If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to give us a rating on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get podcasts. If you'd like to be notified of future weekly shows, please hit the subscribe button. Thank you. Suburban Folk is part of the Pod All the Time podcast network with 6 other great podcasts. They include The Creative Intuitive, Another Digital Citizen, Random Unnamed Podcast, The Cop N Podcast, Big IQ Podcast, and Real AKA Truth. If you check us out on Twitter, you can see links to their direct pages to see what they're up to.